Liberalism was, however, not just a set of ideas. It was also a program of political action. It's necessary now for us to see how these ideas were translated into concrete legislation on the continent, beginning with Britain and France, where these ideas first took deep root. As we saw, liberalism was in essence a middle-class movement, dedicated to free trade, extension of the franchise, assault on privilege, and the call for responsible government. The growth of liberalism must also be seen as a wider European movement, with political parties and groups coalescing around articulate leaders and popularizing their principles through journals, newspapers, organizations, and clubs. Last lecture we saw how liberalism and liberal sentiment in Britain brought about the Great Reform Bill of 1832. However, this landmark legislation still only enfranchised a small part of the adult male electorate, just 1 man in 30. Thus, the Great Reform Bill didn't bring an end to the debate surrounding parliamentary representation at all. Moreover, there were other issues that galvanized liberal opinion, which in fact sharpened the distinctions between the interests of the property-owning elites that still dominated Parliament and the progressive forces of change. But before we begin discussing the rise of the Liberal political party in Britain and hearing the voice of liberal leaders, we first have to see how the ideas of rational progress influenced even the Conservatives. The Conservatives in Britain, after mid-century, cannot be characterized as that union of Colonel Blimp with Squire Western, as is often done. This is a caricature that in fact obscures, in many ways, an even stranger reality. First, we have to note that Conservatives were not necessarily reactionaries, at least not in the highly industrialized societies of Britain and France. On the continent, particularly in the Habsburg Empire, they were indeed often hostile to any form of change, anything that would disrupt the traditional control of government and society by the landed aristocracy. But this isn't true in the West and Europe. Even the great 18th century spokesman in his assault on the French Revolution, Edmund Burke, believed with Montesquieu in organic change, that progress would indeed occur, but that it had to emerge naturally and reasonably from the traditions and the legal practices of a people and their government. Burke's great assault on the French revolutionaries is that their actions were illegal because they were working outside the political and traditional framework of French society and therefore had no validity. But Burke still saw, as did most conservatives in industrialized countries, that change would happen. The real debate was how that change was going to happen and how quickly it would happen. Examples of this had already begun to emerge by the 1840s. At this point, it's not appropriate to think of political groupings as disciplined political parties, at least not in the modern sense. Rather, groups formed around contentious issues that galvanized individuals that shared the same perspective in order to put forward a common argument in order to drive change. But from these groups and from these issues arose the nature of British binary politics. That is, the alternation of power between the Liberals and the Conservatives, who seem not as different as one might have thought. Well, this became clear in the critical battle for the repeal of the Corn Laws. Now, corn simply means grain, so it's not just the yellow stuff on stalks, but oats, wheat, barley, rye, all of the grains that are produced in Europe are commonly called and referred to collectively as corn. The growing population of Britain and Europe had greatly enriched the owners of large estates, almost all of whom were members of the aristocracy or landed gentry. Imported foods suffered under a large import tariff imposed by the landed elite that still controlled Parliament. However, with the rise of the industrial working class, these so-called Corn Laws had a devastating effect on the industrial economy. Workers needed to eat and eat cheaply. Otherwise, their employers would have to pay them more. We have to remember David Ricardo. Wages should result in a stable workforce, not one starving because food was too expensive to buy. Ricardo's argument, remember, in the Iron Law of Wages is that the industrial working class should be fed to the degree that their numbers would not increase, in other words, not increase their fertility, but still be healthy enough to perform their duties in a reasonable way. Moreover, as the urban industrialized classes and the population grew, ever more separated from the ability to produce any of its own food. That is, with the increase in cities and now the second and third generation of industrial workers no longer having the extended family connections into the countryside and having access to cheap food, all they could do was buy it within the town or city. And this, of course, put pressure on the food available and consequently drove up prices. This caused unrest in the pits, unrest in the factories, and in the cities in general. It also caused concern among the owners and the investors in factories, because they were the ones that had to pay for the food through wages, and they also were the ones that had to maintain some kind of security within their factories or pits. And so to ensure that food would be available was one of their concerns as well. This then linked the industrial classes who worked in the factories with the middle class owners and investors in the factories and mines. To keep wages low then, imported food, now available very cheaply and in huge amounts from the United States, the British Empire, and elsewhere, must be made available to enter Britain without tariffs. The Liberals all believed in free trade. It was an article of faith. They accepted on principle. But the landed elite fought this intensely because it was the source of their wealth, and they were making huge profits from the sale of surplus food. A crisis, though, was precipitated in the 1840s by the terrible Irish famine. To address the widespread famine in the Irish territories of Britain, brought about by reliance on too few crops, it was necessary to import a great deal of food cheaply and quickly. Realizing this, the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, the same man who began the first organized police force in London, who was a moderate conservative, initiated the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. The tariffs on imported grain were lifted, and thus the landed classes lost their source of enormous wealth, which they could count upon, which was the basis of their economic control. But workers and factory owners benefited because the workers could get food more cheaply and wages could be kept at a reasonable level. But it wasn't Peel who created a new Conservative Party able to appeal to middle-class electors. There arose a most extraordinary man who would take liberal ideas and domesticate them into a conservative platform in order to allow them to speak for the new dynamic middle classes, especially those who wanted to see change happen, but in a managed, measured way. That man was Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli was a most remarkable man indeed. He was of Italian Jewish ancestry, and indeed his religion would have kept him out of public life had his father not had him baptized at the age of 12. He was first elected to Parliament in 1837, and in fact, again, had he not been baptized a Christian, he would not have been able to take his seat because Jewish emancipation in Britain didn't occur until 1845. And Disraeli was not your caricature of a conservative. He was a spendthrift. He went through his own money so quickly that he couldn't sustain his own debts. He was a dandy wearing the most outrageous flowered waistcoats. And he was a popular novelist, something that conservatives generally distrust. And moreover, it was in his novels that he really let some of his perspective, his broad perspective, be revealed. It was Disraeli in one of his novels that identified the two Englands. That is, an England of middle-class comfort and wealth and optimism and knowledge and scientism and education, and then the industrial Britain of the poor and the oppressed. This image then of two Englands, two Britons, became part of the vocabulary of change. And interestingly enough, it was the product of an individual who was conservative by political affiliation and also to some extent by nature, but one who saw the need for change and had the ability to take these dynamic new forces and integrate them into the traditional perspective of conservative parties. He was first despised and rejected by members of the Conservative Party, partly out of anti-Semitism, and also because of his curious appearance, his arrogance, and his activities. I mean, when he was young, for example, he dressed like a Greek pirate, went to the Ottoman Empire in search of Lord Byron's manservant, found him, brought him back to serve in his father's house. This is not your usual image of the reactionary conservative at all, a remarkable man. It took time then for Disraeli to establish himself among the Tories. But by 1868, he had risen to power. In part, this was because of a very advantageous marriage. He married a political widow, 12 years older than he was, and it was her money and her contacts, as well as her common sense, that controlled him to a great degree. And that led to his very, very famous statement that the first time he married his wife, it was for money. Had he had the chance again, he would marry her for love. He revitalized the conservatives. He appealed to middle-class urban voters. He began to steal some of these away from the traditional liberal party to which there was a natural affection. And he began to build a new consensus, a new political consensus that gave the last years of Victoria's reign their character. He was, as Britain's Prime Minister in 1868 and again between 1874 and 1880, a great supporter of monarchy, a great supporter of the British Empire. It was Disraeli who was responsible both for Britain acquiring its interest in the Suez Canal, which was a necessary and useful link between the empire, especially India, and Europe, and also for Victoria. Victoria adored him because, in part, he gave her the title of Empress of India, and also because he flattered her in the way that she loved to be flattered. Remarkably for a conservative, he also championed liberal causes. It was Disraeli and the Conservatives that passed the Trade Union Act in 1875 that permitted not only union organization, but also, in fact, in a certain way, permitted strikes. And he also passed a Public Health Act that same year to improve urban sanitation. These are classic liberal policies, but Disraeli knew that these measures were required both by national interest and also by humane concern. He was, after all, the inventor of the term Two Britons. When Victoria raised him to the peerage as Lord Beaconsfield, another astounding example of change was evident. From a baptized Jew born 25 years before the repeal of the Test Acts that kept non-Anglicans out of power in Britain, to Prime Minister, then to a peer of the realm and one of Britain's heroes, and in fact, the Queen's favorite Prime Minister. This is a remarkable story, not only of social mobility, but also of the change in attitudes in society and even amongst the Conservative Party that could see Disraeli becoming one of the representatives and one of the heroes to young Britain. In fact, the affection between Victoria and Benjamin Disraeli was clear as he lay dying. The Queen sent a note to him and suggested that perhaps he would like a visit. He politely refused and noted that the reason for this is that she just wanted him to carry a message to her beloved Albert, who had died years before. The Liberals, too, were fortunate. The Liberals were fortunate in having great leaders, especially John Bright and William Ewart Gladstone. Bright illustrates the link between the traditions of 18th and 19th century radicalism and liberalism. He was born in a dissenting family. He was a Quaker. And Bright was also enormously rich, a Manchester cotton mill owner. He was a member of the Parliamentary Radicals, a group that was opposed to the land monopoly, which provided the elites with legal, financial, and political privileges. He was also opposed to the Church of England, which sought to exclude nonconformists like him from politics and education. Bright was also the voice of conscience in Britain. He was the voice of the anti-Corn Law crusade. It was he who led the opposition to British entry in the Crimean War, saying, why is it that Britain is fighting for the Ottoman Empire, the most unreconstructed state in Europe, against the rapacious and repressive and autocratic Russian Empire? This made no sense to him. And also, it was largely Bright's counsel that kept Britain out of the US Civil War. In 1861, war between the United States and Britain seemed to be largely a matter of time. In 1861, an American warship stopped a British steamer in the high seas and took off 2 Confederate diplomats and their diplomatic pouches. This was an act of international piracy, and the British were so infuriated that they mobilized the fleet for war, and they mobilized an army and sent the army to Canada for an invasion of the United States from the north. It was Bright who intervened. He reminded the British, who were universally in support of the Confederacy in the Civil War, that in fact the war was about slavery, as well as about the manipulation of the cotton market, about traditional connections and family associations between the South and Britain. It was Bright who reminded the British that the slave trade and slavery that the British had abolished so many decades before was the real issue. And indeed, that and the statesmanship of the American president, Abraham Lincoln, who realized that the Americans had made a serious mistake, especially when Congress commended the commander of that warship, that he had to apologize. It was Lincoln's formal apology to the British that allowed the British to extricate themselves, despite the fact that the country had already put on a war footing. And indeed, that was a particular moment, because not only did the British realize that they had moral issues at stake, but also they realized that, in fact, they had really done the right thing. And just as an aside, Lincoln, with a kind of tongue-in-cheek, also suggested that the British Army, which by then had reached the coast of North America, might in fact prefer to land at an American port out of convenience, rather than having to go up the St. Lawrence to Canada. The offer was refused, but nevertheless, I think it set the right tone that allowed the Americans to concentrate on one war at a time. When we see Bright, though, we see other things. He believed strongly, and this is one of the most powerful perspectives that he brought to liberal politics, that the doctrine of improvement must be active. It must be an active pursuit. Passive, laissez-faire policies were not going to change society. He argued that the law must be changed in order to redress wrongs, to initiate social reforms, to protect the poor and the weak, to extend education to everyone, and to build a progressive society. This was the responsibility of the community acting through government. It wasn't a group of individuals or a party or clubs or the act of philanthropy. It had to be done through the instrument of the state. As a pacifist, Bright could never hold political office at a senior level. But he fortunately had an associate in William Ewart Gladstone, who was not a pacifist at all, and who had the energy, in fact his hobby was chopping wood, and the wealth to fight for things that Bright believed in. Gladstone possessed the eloquence. He was one of the great rhetorical public speakers of the 19th century, even though Queen Victoria, who powerfully disliked him, said that he always addressed her like a public meeting. And he had the leadership ability needed to direct the Commons in the country. And in fact, he came to represent English liberalism until the end of the century. Gladstone was the son of a very rich Liverpool sugar merchant, and he had the political skill to turn abstract principle into simple, concrete legislation that would have an enormous effect on the country. Gladstone, like Bright, supported free trade, and he called also for improvement to education, especially for the lower classes. So what he did is that he called for an end to tariffs on paper, which had inflated the price of newspapers, books, and writing paper. When the tariff was repealed, prices for these items fell sharply, which gained him the support of the radicals in the working class, as well as those who were demanding immediate change. Newspapers and cheap political magazines multiplied, helping progressive causes and bringing all literate Englishmen into political debate. After taking charge of the Liberal Party in 1866, Gladstone began agitating for the introduction of a new reform bill, the 1867 Reform Act. The Reform Act of 1832 had become insufficient to meet the changing needs of Britain. So Gladstone introduced the second Reform Bill in the spring of 1866. But the opposition in the Commons was too great, especially great from conservatives and landowners and those generally who were quite content with the unrepresentative form of the House of Commons as it was then constituted, because they feared its democratic content. In other words, the franchise would be extended to the point that more and more people with less and less property would be able to hold public office and vote. Popular disturbances, though, were organized. Disturbances organized not only by liberals, but also by radicals in support of the passage of this bill. So, again, our friend Benjamin Disraeli enters the drama. In a typical show of brilliant statesmanship and theater, the conservative leader in the Commons, Disraeli, preempted the opposition and he introduced the bill. And so the Reform Bill passed and increased the franchise to all male householders in the boroughs and counties who not only owned but rented property. This doubled the electorate, giving the vote to one adult male in 15 rather than 30. But despite Disraeli's brilliant maneuver, the new Reform Act was understood to have been a liberal rather than a conservative victory. So in 1868, the Liberals were returned to power. This was Gladstone's first ministry, and it was to last until 1874. And it was a period when the ideas of Bentham, Mill, and Bright began to be translated into legislation. All appointments to the civil service in 1870 had to be determined by competitive exams open to all. These competitive examinations completely destroyed the system of that small club of aristocratic and well-born individuals who gave jobs in the civil service and diplomatic service to their relations and friends. It meant that the giving of political favors to individuals who had helped the party gave way to examinations that made sure that the very, very best people would represent Britain internally and externally. The Education Act of 1870 gave England school districts and local school boards, and also the right to levy rates, that is, local property taxes, to pay for schools and for government inspectors to ensure quality. England wouldn't have free universal elementary education until 1891, in part because of the tradition of private, that is, public education in Britain. But nevertheless, there were the foundations laid of a public education system that would ultimately prove to be very successful. And in 1872, Gladstone introduced a secret ballot to make sure that voting would no longer be the result of pressure and intimidation. Similarly, he addressed the problems of Ireland, always corrosive to any British government. To pacify the Roman Catholic population, the Liberals disestablished the Anglican Church in Ireland and released Catholics from paying tithes to it. Previously, Roman Catholics had to pay tithes to the Anglican Church. No wonder they were angry. Irish tenants were protected from arbitrary eviction by the Irish Land Acts of 1870 and 1881, but Parliament was unwilling to seek further regulation of landlord-tenant relations because it was, again, a liberal article of faith that goes right back to John Locke, that property is absolute, and the Liberals did not want to interfere with the rights of property. Liberal policy in Britain, then, was the consequence of the usual method of effective political platform and organization and far-sighted statesmen who instituted change through Act of Parliament, using the institution of government to ensure that change would happen according to principles that were broadly disseminated and widely discussed. The modern political world, in fact, has been formed. The situation in France was very different. Although similar liberal political organizations existed, the institutions necessary to establish liberal government were the result of an emperor's commitment to liberal policy. There had been a long liberal tradition in France and French political thinking and action that linked the philosophes of the 18th century with the political thinkers and the activists who became their leaders in the early 19th. Amongst the most articulate liberal spokesmen in this period was Benjamin Constant, now best remembered as a novelist, the author of Adolphe and the Red Notebook. Constant, though, had studied economics at Edinburgh, the place of Adam Smith. He enjoyed, as his lover for decades, the incomparable Madame de Staël, the hostess of a progressive salon, friend of so many of the philosophes, and also daughter of a famous finance minister under the Ancien Régime. He was also an active politician, serving under the Restoration monarchy until 1830 and fighting for political liberty, freedom of the press, and restrictions on the crown. And in the 1820s, these were very, very dangerous actions. Well, why? In 1824, Louis XVIII died, and he was succeeded by his brother, Charles X, who was the most reactionary of reactionaries. He was one of the leaders of the exiles during the French Revolution, putting together armies and alliances to try and suppress the revolution through force of arms. But then he became king. He not only was a political reactionary, he was a religious reactionary, a strong supporter of the Roman Catholic Church, returning to it the lands that had been taken during the Revolution. He gave the church more and more control over education, and in general, he tried to turn the clock back as much as he could to the Ancien Régime. Liberals responded by forming secret societies, and they joined one another in parliamentary opposition to Charles and the ultra-royalists. Charles then responded by issuing the July Ordinances in the summer of 1830. These dissolved the new Chamber of Deputies before it even met. It restricted freedom of the press, and it reduced the suffrage. Parisians refused to accept this. They took to the streets, and the press, ignoring all of these new restrictions, attacked the monarchy and the king's ministers. Stirring the crowd to take action as they had in 1789, the barricades came up on the streets of Paris, and this is the revolution celebrated in the musical Les Mis. Troops inflicted casualties on the populace, but the revolutionaries won, forcing Charles to abdicate in August of 1830. He was replaced by another king, though, a cousin, the so-called bourgeois or citizen king, Louis-Philippe. He too had a very strange biography. Louis was an Orléans of the cadet branch of the French royal Bourbon house. The Orléans tended to be a bit more liberal, and this is illustrated perhaps best through his father, who had been Louis XVI's cousin. His father, the Duke d'Orléans, at the time of the Revolution, changed his name from Philippe d'Orléans to Philippe l'Égalité, to Philip Equality. He was elected a member of the National Assembly during the Revolution. He renounced his titles and privileges, and he even voted for the execution of his cousin the king. But of course, it was only a matter of time before he too met Madame Guillotine during the Terror. Louis-Philippe, though, seems to have recovered from this very curious childhood, and the result was a boring, hard-working, solid man who would in fact be a relatively good king, but an extraordinarily boring one. The French, even the liberals, were not content with his regime, which was becoming increasingly conservative. And of course, everybody was bored. In fact, his long-serving foreign minister and later prime minister, the famous historian François Guizot, said about France, anytime anything was raised that would improve France's position internationally, la France est assez grande. France is big enough, let's leave it the way it is. And when the liberals were arguing for a broader franchise, his response was always the same. Enrichissez-vous. Make yourself wealthier, and once you've got more money, then we'll give you the vote, because property and the franchise should go together. It's not an accident then that in 1848, when revolution swept Europe, Louis-Philippe was deposed. Louis-Philippe was deposed by the revolution, and he went into exile in England. And there arose in the chaos after this revolution a new republic, the short-lived Second Republic. A new constitution was established, and elected president of this new republic was another extraordinary, curious, almost impossible person, Prince Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the great Napoleon, the son of his brother Joseph, who had been King of Holland. And what's more, Louis Napoleon, although he had a very odd previous life as an adventurer, was an able politician. And in 1851, Louis Napoleon organized a coup against the republic he had sworn to uphold, and he established himself as dictator, just as his uncle had done in 1799. And then on the 2nd of December, 1852, the 48th anniversary of his uncle's coronation, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of the French, supported again by a plebiscite. The Second Empire had begun, and Napoleon III was sitting on his uncle's throne. Napoleon III has been called a utopian socialist on horseback, because he truly believed that the spoils of industrialization that had so benefited the middle and upper classes should be shared by all members of French society. The emperor advocated free trade, greater industrialization, and sought to improve the hygiene and the health of French cities. He provided fresh water, sewers, clean streets, and introduced a massive public works program that reduced unemployment. The most dramatic of this huge program was the rebuilding of Paris under his prefect of the Seine, Baron Haussmann. The Paris we know today is a result, and the warren of medieval streets and dark, dangerous, and unhealthy alleys was replaced by the wide avenues and elegant squares and domestic and public architecture that we see today in the French capital. Improved relations between England and France benefited French agriculture. Free trade was also reached with Belgium, Italy, Sweden, Austria, and even Turkey. In political affairs, the emperor grew increasingly liberal. The 1852 Constitution was hardly supportive of a liberal parliamentary democracy. But by 1860, Napoleon III permitted the two houses of Parliament, the legislative body and Senate, to respond to his speech from the throne, and that publication of parliamentary debates be encouraged. He allowed relaxed restrictions on the press. Elections to Parliament were free from intimidation and corruption. And once in Parliament, members were given the opportunity to challenge the emperor over the budget and to carry out ministerial functions without much control by the crown. Educational reforms made the Second Empire far ahead of Britain. Compulsory free education in France existed for all, and it was not dominated by the church. Poor and lower middle class children were brought into the system and trained for vocations in industry and finance. These reforms began in the 1860s and are representative of the liberal democratic desire to see the implementation of universal education. Trade unions were legalized and they were permitted to strike. And at the end of the empire in 1870, the leader of the opposition was asked to form a government that would be independent of the emperor. At this point, France had attained a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, not through revolution, but through the acceptance of liberal principles and their application by an emperor who saw himself as a liberal. In the plebiscite held on this empire in May of 1870 against the opposition, Napoleon was victorious, outpolling them 5-1. Napoleon III was a popular man, but the defeat of the Second Empire at Sedan during the Franco-Prussian War ended his rule and led to the foundation of the Third Republic in 1871. Next, we must turn to another progressive idea, assumed in most liberal movements, the relationship between science and progress, to see how the ideas that were percolated through industrialized Europe would then, in fact, be associated with the idea of change, something that the liberals called their own, but nevertheless became built into any European system that was moving towards what the citizens believed, and especially their political leaders felt was required: change, and change for the better, according to principles that were reasonable, rational, and fair.